All right, welcome back everybody. It's Brock and Abigail. Welcome to today's video. Go ahead, grab a seat, settle in, because we're gonna jump right into it. Today, we're looking at a figure from history who, usually gets painted as this flawless, glowing saint in a stained glass window. But the reality is actually way more relatable to us. We're talking about a guy named Timothy, and I wanna introduce him to you today. Not as someone who had it all together from day one, but as a total underdog. We're talking about someone who wrestled with real anxiety, who had a less than perfect family, and who basically had people constantly looking down on. And yet, despite all of that, he became one of the primary architects of the entire early Christian church.
But before we get to him, I want to start by asking you a really direct question. Do you have to wait until you're an adult to actually do something that matters? Seriously, think about that for a second. Because culture often tells you that your current phase of life, middle school, junior high, it's basically just like a waiting room, right? Like it's just time to sit back, follow the rules, and wait your turn until you have a degree or a fancy title, or you hit a specific age before God can actually use you for anything significant. I remember struggling with this. Like, I'm too young to be bold for Jesus. I'm too young to serve at church. But as we're going to see through Timothy's story today, that idea is completely backwards.
All right, part one, the unlikely young leader. Let's look at the reality of Timothy's starting point. We first meet him in the book of Acts. He's living in this small city called Lystra, which is over in modern day Turkey. He isn't famous, he isn't powerful, he's just a young guy trying to figure out his faith in a world that's frankly incredibly hostile to it. He is, by pretty much every traditional metric, a completely unlikely candidate for global leadership.
Okay, so let's dive into this comparison. If you were building a resume to find an influential leader, you'd probably look for some traditional traits, right? You'd want someone that's older, someone with a flawless background, someone who is just entirely fearless. But that wasn't Timothy at all. He was young and he grew up in a divided home, and he wrestled really deeply with natural timidity. He was literally the exact opposite of the polished ideal.
To really understand him, we have to look at his roots. Timothy grew up in a spiritually divided household. His dad was Greek, which likely meant he didn't share the faith, while his Jewish mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois, were deeply devoted and raised him on the Hebrew scriptures. And I point this out because for any of you sitting here today who feel like your family is, kind of complicated or messy or spiritually divided, if you feel like that somehow disqualifies you from being used by God, Timothy is the living proof that your imperfect background does not limit your potential. In fact, God uses that exact unique story for his purpose.
Moving right along to part two, finding a spiritual mentor. Timothy's entire trajectory completely changed during the Apostle Paul's second missionary journey. Paul arrived in Lystra, and he immediately spotted something different about this young man. This encounter sparked what is arguably the single most important mentor-mentee relationship in early church history. It wasn't just a boss and assistant type thing. It was a completely life-changing dynamic.
Let's trace this timeline to see how this builds across his life. It all starts with the meeting in Lystra. Paul sees Timothy's faith and just invites him on the road. Then comes the mission. Timothy isn't just carrying Paul's bags here. He's a vital part of the team, traveling through Greece and Asia Minor, planting and strengthening churches. He's getting a front row seat, watching Paul live out the gospel in real time, learning how to preach, pray, and honestly, endure some severe persecution. Finally, we reach the assignment. Timothy evolves from a traveling companion to Paul's absolute and most trusted troubleshooter. When a church was in crisis, Paul sent Timothy. He went to Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, and ultimately he was sent to Ephesus.
The bond they shared was honestly pretty incredible. Paul famously calls Timothy his true son in the faith. But you gotta wonder, why did Paul choose him in the first place? Well, the Bible actually tells us that Paul noticed Timothy because of his excellent reputation among the local believers. Timothy wasn't just putting on a show for the visiting VIP. He was already serving faithfully in his hometown. He had integrity when nobody was watching, and that authentic character, that's exactly what drew Paul to him.
Which brings us to part three, leading through the hate. So Timothy gets his ultimate assignment. He's sent to serve as the lead pastor in Ephesus. And guys, this was not an easy gig. Ephesus was a massive, intimidating city, just filled with idol worship and false teachings. But the hardest part wasn't even the outside culture, it was the inside of the church. Timothy faced fierce opposition from older church members who actively looked down on him just because of his age. He had to step up and fix this incredibly toxic culture while dealing with people who fundamentally disrespected him.
And this just shows the tension Timothy lived in and exactly how Paul coached him through it. Look, Timothy faced very real hurdles. He was timid by nature. He suffered from frequent physical illness, which made the job very exhausting. He was young, and his family background wasn't the elite religious standard of the day. But Paul didn't just tell him to toughen up or fake it. Paul's solutions were deeply practical. Stay rooted in the truth of God's word. Focus on your character, and make sure everything, absolutely everything you do, points back to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
All right, part 4, the 1 Timothy playbook. Because Paul knew his young protege needed some serious encouragement and strategy, he wrote him letters packed with practical wisdom and bold challenges. This brings us to what we can basically call the 1 Timothy playbook. And this isn't just ancient history. This is a timeless, highly actionable guide for any young leader today who feels underqualified or totally overwhelmed by the culture around them.
Right in the middle of this letter, Paul delivers this super encouraging message. He writes in 1 Timothy 4:12, "Don't let anyone think less of you because you are young." He acknowledges the hurdle right out of the gate. Yes, people might judge you for your age, they might assume you lack wisdom, but Paul is telling Timothy, and he's telling you that your age is not a stop sign. God can use you at any age.
Now, what's really interesting here is how specific Paul gets. He doesn't just say, hey, go be a good person. He gives Timothy 5 distinct areas to master. He says, be an example in your speech, literally how you talk to and about others in your life, your everyday habits and actions, and your love, how sacrificially you care for people, and your faith, your deep trust in God when things get incredibly hard, and in your purity, maintaining your integrity in a completely compromised culture. He's telling Timothy that even at his young age, he can set an example for those around him by the way he lives.
Okay, part 5, your turn to lead. Timothy's faithfulness ensured that the message of Christ would survive and actually thrive for future generations. Timothy overcame his youth, his anxiety, and his mixed background to leave a massive world-changing legacy. And that brings us directly to your lives today. God doesn't wait for you to reach a certain status before he decides to use you. You can be a leader right now, exactly where you are. As you're wanting to overcome the tendency to think you're too young, I want to look at this verse. Paul wrote this to Timothy, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind."
As we shift into our group discussion for today's class, I want you to really process this. Here's your first question to chew on. How does Timothy's story encourage those of us who don't come from a perfect Christian environment? Seriously, if your home life is complicated, or if you feel like you're walking this faith out largely on your own, how does seeing God use someone like Timothy change your perspective on your own potential?
Second question. Looking at Paul's playbook in 1 Timothy 4:12, which of those 5 areas, speech, life, love, faith, or purity, is the most challenging for you to be an example in today? Look, we all have weak spots. The goal isn't to pretend that we're perfect, but to identify where we need God's grace and where we need to intentionally ask Him to help us live out one of those areas this week.
And finally, I want to leave you with this question hanging in the air. Timothy didn't do this alone. He had Paul. Who's been a spiritual mentor in your life? And do you have someone to guide you, challenge you, and push you closer to Jesus? If not, talk to your leaders about finding a mentor today. You guys don't have to wait to be used in big ways by God. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next time.